Hi, folks. Welcome to Experiential Realism. Today, I'm engaging in a trialogue with two very special guests, Professors Philip Clayton and Richard Oxenberg. I've had both of them on the show before, and today we're going to be discussing philosophical and theological ideas, and we're going to go through their opinions. And some of these ideas were embraced by the likes of Paul Tillich, Martin Heidegger, and Thomas Aquinas, to name a few. I hope you take something of value from this conversation. I hope you learn something, as I'm sure I definitely will. And if you enjoy it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And without further ado, I give you the professors. Okay. Hi, gentlemen. Welcome to Experiential Realism. And we're here to
Thanks for
discuss.
having us, Arlindo. It's great to be
Yeah,
with
no
us.
problem. It's an honor. It's a pleasure to have both of you. Actually, it's a bit of a dream come true, really, because I
Uh,
think we're going to be able to educate the audience, disseminate ideas, and I think I'm going to learn a lot from you too. So I'm more interested in hearing your opinions, your perspectives, and you may reference what prominent philosophers have already said about these topics. But I'm interested in the perspective of um, someone who knows about these subjects, someone who knows about theology, philosophy, and also who has experience with the modern world and also perhaps express their own views based on their own experiences and their own lives. And, I just want to hear from both of you as though you are modern day Socrates or Plato, something like that.
really nice.
It's my first time doing this. But yeah, last night, um, I came across this question. I don't know where, but I decided to answer it last night. And the question goes like this. What's the theological answer to the ontological analysis of the human situation, right? And I started thinking about the concept of imago Dei that me and Philip discussed 4 weeks ago. And I thought about the meaning of life and our purpose here on earth. And I think that as human beings, we're supposed to reflect God's uh, love, wisdom, creativity here on earth. Because after all, we are supposed to be made in God's image, or we're made in God's likeness, basically. So we're something like God. We have a spark of divinity in us, and we need to put that to good use. These are my thoughts anyway, and I also wrote down that because we're divinely inspired, if we're really listening to that nature, which is everywhere, and it's inside us. We can be divinely inspired to steward the earth, our world, um, and we should also strive to understand our fellow human beings and also animals, every sentient creature, as much as we possibly can, as much as humanly possible. And I think by doing that, we should also try to love unconditionally, as God does, and and we should strive towards divine ideals, despite the fact that we are surrounded by a challenging world and also we are faced with our own limitations. So these are the thoughts I had when I was trying to answer the question. So you guys may answer the question and comment on my answer, or do both, or do one, or whatever comes to mind, basically. Who would like
So,
to go
Arlindo,
first?
can you reformulate that very opening question? And then I'll ask Richard if he wants to go first or not. But just the very opening
Riff.
question so that we can have it in front of us and the audience.
Right. So reformulate the question here. So the question,
The very opening words that you read.
right, the very opening words. What's the theological answer to the ontological analysis of the human situation? So to me, the way I understand the question is, um, if God exists, what does it mean to be in our situation right now? Um, and what should we do about it if there is a greater mind or something beyond that we should be aspiring to? Um, how would you go about answering this question?
Mhm.
I hope I've
Uh,
reformulated it and
Totally clear. I
simplified
just
it
wanted to see
maybe.
if Richard wants to go first or
I'll be happy to go first. So I think that to try and answer that question, it's of course it is in some sense the question, isn't it? Um, uh, we first of all have to think about what is the ontological analysis that requires a theological answer. Um, and um, and in my way of looking at it, the way that I've come to think of it, um, there is an ontological predicament that is inherent to the nature of creation itself. And that is that, especially human beings, although I think we see it perhaps in the whole organic realm in some sense, and that is that the individual, here let's just focus on the human, is um, is ontologically uh, um, dedicated to or determined to or seeking its own its own ontological security, its own ontological fulfillment. But as contingent beings, as beings that are dependent upon what is fundamental in being, we don't have the power to secure ourselves ontologically in ourselves. And this I see as the basic fundamental predicament of human existence. Um, we strive, we are in a sense teleologically directed to find uh, ontological satisfaction, but we can't because we are not ontologically whole. We are parts of a whole that is greater than us. And it is only God, to use the traditional term, that is ontologically self-subsistent, that is the basis of existence. And so it is only through some sort of relationship to that which is self-subsistent, to that which is the universal basis of being. Um, uh, Tillich, Paul Tillich speaks of it as the ground of being. It is only through some sort of relationship to that that we can finally find our own true security and satisfaction and fulfillment. Um, and uh, and and so then that leads us in two directions. One is that to the extent that we cannot, for whatever reason, enter into such a relationship, our lives become distorted because we seek to find this fulfillment through finite goods and finite conditions that will never provide that fulfillment. And so we have what the Greeks called pleonexia, uh, with the endless desire for more. I think in the Christian tradition, it's called concupiscence. The never it never can be satisfied. The desires that never can be satisfied. And we have billionaires who need more billions, and people who have tremendous amount of power who need more power. And it's insatiable because no amount of money, no amount of power, no amount of claim is going to provide for that ontological security. I think that this gets expressed in the Gospels when Jesus says, he who would save his life will lose it. In other words, if we try to secure our life through ourselves, we'll lose it. And so then this leads to the other alternative, so to speak, the other way of addressing this, which is just what I think you've spoken of in your answer, Arlindo, and that is to try and enter into um, a loving relationship with that which is universal, with the being that is universal, which is God. And as universal, that being embraces all beings. And so the way to enter into that relationship is through a kind of self transcendence of love, um, which expresses itself both as a concern for others and also from a socio-political point of view as a quest for justice. Um, and and that then is what resolves, to the extent that it is going to be resolved, because I think there's always, I think, again, to refer to Paul Tillich, he says it's always only fragmentarily resolved. But that resolves the human predicament. And so that is my general answer to the question, um, as I've come to think about it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's a good one. You can derive teleology, purpose. It's a way in which humans can aim higher, and you get to experience or act out transcendence, I suppose. And it's almost like a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and it gives us a kind of freedom to make that journey towards God, which we probably don't really understand, or we may try to understand partially. I know me and Philip talked about apophatic and cataphatic approaches, and maybe there is a way in which we can partially come to understand God, or at least intuit His nature and move towards it, and do our best, and try and emulate Christ. And if we don't get to Christ, at least we may make as much effort as someone like Moses, or I don't know. I know Moses is seen as the friend, as God's friend. So I don't know. We can be divinely inspired and move towards that goal. To try and it allows for progress, doesn't it? We can find um, progress in humility. We can humble ourselves and realize that we are not. There's so much more room for improvement in every way. We can improve our lives. We can do good. We can improve morally. And I think you've said it all. But yeah, I'd like to hear what do you think about this, Philip?
It's interesting. The
Now
three
you've
of
got
us
two
have,
two views. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
that the three of us have analogous views, all really based on the way that you structured the question, which I think each of us is leaning into in a similar way. So you began with philosophy, the ontological analysis. You asked about the theological response. And then for all three of us, that leads over to an existential question or an existential quest for humans in general, or for each of us. We share the sense that we are not ontologically self-sufficient beings. So we know ourselves with what Germans call a Mangel, something that's missing. We conceive the idea of a causa sui, a being that's the cause of itself, that is dependent on nothing else. Um, that's now when as soon as we take that move, we begin to move over into the theological, and we know ourselves in contrast to that. So, put it differently, we can conceive a being where there's no contrast between the ontological conditions for existence and the theological answer. In fact, the two get wedded in this one case. So, God is put forward as a metaphysical response as well as the center of a theological response. And then, so the theologian then begins to think about the nature of this being that is not dependent on anything else for its existence. Then we come along and recognize ourselves as existentially lacking. And that's an area where I hope that we can go deeper into in this particular conversation. What does it mean to know ourselves both as separate, right? We have our own drive and connected, both independent, so we initiate actions, and dependent. We are the effect of causes coming from others. Um, and I still like this notion from Pico della Mirandola in the 15th century, early 15th century, who says we are the animal without a form. So in his myth or his story, God created every other being with its own form, but we don't have that pre-given guiding, determining nature. And you see that in a tradition that I hope we can talk about, the German philosophical anthropology of the early 20th century, Plessner, Galen, Scheele, who are trying to think of what it is to be a human that isn't complete. What's unique about ourselves here in an age of science, in a biology that connects us with all other animals? Existentially, we are like these other animals, and yet there's that something different, which I think your question brings to the surface. Ontological, theological, now anthropological, and I take that as the starting point that you've given us for this conversation.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. I think that we have the being in common with everything else, other humans, including animals. Uh, but at the same time, it's almost like we feel ourselves to be separate from everything else. And there is such a thing as um, us, our existence preceding essence, isn't there? It's almost like we're thrust upon the world. I think Martin Heidegger said something like that, and Paul Sartre, we're thrust upon the world, and then it's almost like we have to find our purpose, or we have to find our calling. And sometimes by
Actually,
engaging with
let's
the
let's make
world,
that really specific because I think
yeah,
Heidegger and Tillich are going to play a role in this conversation. It comes out in Being in Time in the definition of Sorge or care, and it's a fascinating phrase that is his anthropology in a single sentence, all with dashes separating the words in German and then in English. Das sich vorweg schon sein in der Welt, sein bei innerweltlich begegneten Seiendem. So we have three aspects to ourselves. We're always out front of ourselves, sich vorweg, anticipating a future that isn't there. Heidegger would say anticipating our own death. Schon sein in der Welt. We're always already within a world. We're thrown into the world from the beginning
yeah,
through no choice of our own.
yeah.
And then dealing with the third part, dealing with the other beings and humans whom we encounter around us. That's a fantastic starting for an, if you will, existential understanding of human existence. And I
Yes,
think all
and
three of us want to go deeper into where that might lead.
Yeah. Yeah, Richard?
and what then? Yeah, then what ties that into the notion of lack, right? And of course, Heidegger himself uses that to discuss what he calls nullity, the nullity by which human existence is permeated. Nullity is a very suggestive phrase because of course, it implies something that is missing, right? And something can only be missing to the extent that one is somehow teleologically ordered to its presence, right? But Heidegger doesn't really take us there to what the
Mhm.
presence is that would somehow satisfy the sense of nullity that our thrownness upon death presents to us. Um, and yet it seemed to me that it is somewhat implicit in the notion of angst
Mm.
because and anxiety, which uh, which I believe Heidegger understands precisely this experience of nullity or this sense of nullity,
Yeah.
where nullity really means not having a foundation, not having a sense of one's being as grounded in any solid foundation. Um, And again, we can contrast that once again with the notion of God as causa sui, or the God, because God is precisely, in some sense, I think the way you expressed it was God's ontology is uh, is compatible with with the theology. But maybe we could say that God's ontology is consistent with God's teleology, so that
Hmm.
God's ontology answers God's teleology, whereas the ontology of the human individual regarded in himself or herself does not does not provide for the satisfaction of the human teleology. And that
That's a great distinction. Richard, I wonder how could a being that is ontologically complete still have a teleology?
well, that's very well. Now we get into some difficult. uh,
Like
um,
Spinoza would say no, but a lot of the theistic tradition said yes.
well, can a teleology be? Can one have a teleology that is fulfilled? In other words,
Ah,
one can right? Can one have be in the fulfillment of one teleology, such
well,
that? And
a
I think
perfect
that
human would, because he or she would have a reason for being, a teleology, and perfectly fulfill that at every moment. We could imagine that would be the perfect human being. But could a divine being who is complete in its ontology also have a goal directedness? Like if we're going to translate teleology, I
well,
don't have an answer. I just puzzle. I find it a
yeah.
fascinating puzzle.
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful question, and and it's a question that I think that I mean now we're trying to get into the head of God, so to speak. So that might be just a little bit difficult of a project. But if we can speculate our way into this, um, we can imagine a being. I think that in a lot of religious traditions, God is said to be in a condition of eternal bliss. And bliss would precisely be the word that we might use to express the fulfillment of teleology, of a teleological drive. Now, I mean, if we, we have no other choice, so to speak, but to try and imagine this from our human perspective. And I mean, even eternal bliss would seem to get boring, if it never, I mean, our experience of bliss always happens in relationship to our experience of overcoming the lack of bliss. And
Yeah.
but just suppose for a moment that the creation, and this is the way that I've also have come to think of it, is that God is naturally or natively creative, and
Mm.
so that the creation emerges out of God almost necessarily as part of God's teleology, the way that I think of it as a singer wants to sing, right? A dancer wants to dance. God wants to create. And that creation then presents God and us with many problems that require a teleological solution. So, in some sense, God's teleology becomes invested in uh, in the endeavor to provide fulfillment within the creation itself.
Oh, I
And
love
that
that answer.
then
Just
just
two
just
elements to throw into the conversation, see where it takes us.
one little. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Yeah. So it's fascinating to see you focus on bliss. I think of the most parsimonious panentheist in the world, possibly the truest pantheist in the world, in uh, in the Indian Shankara, in the Indian tradition, and he boiled. So his was Brahman or the divine without any attributes, Nirguna Brahman, and yet he still asserted that the divine had three attributes, which he called Satchitananda,
Satchitananda
Satchit and Ananda, being consciousness and bliss.
and
So he
bliss.
made bliss primordial in, which is why many of the yogis use the Ananda as part of their name, the bliss
You know,
part. But
yeah.
there's no teleology there because this God is not responding. And yet, in the And probably not in Spinoza either. I mean, he actually fights teleological thinking, and his one and all is also reliant only on itself. But when you throw in creation, so something that's becoming God, or if we can say traditionally, God creates something contingent. Now God has a telos, even while the divine is not teleological in its fundamental nature. Where does that take you? That's what I heard in your answer.
Yeah, yeah, and so if we, I mean, so we go back to go to the beginning of the Bible, um, and um, and God, in the first chapter of the Bible, God creates the world, and on each day of that creation, God declares it to be good, and finally at the end, God declares it to be very good. So those are, of course, good is a teleological term,
Yeah.
right? What we mean by good is the satisfaction of some telos, some teleology.
Except
Um,
in summum bonum, in the highest good, where there wouldn't be a teleology, maybe, apart from the
yeah,
creation.
but once again, I guess I keep thinking of I don't think we do away with teleology when we imagine a fulfilled teleology. In other words,
Mm.
fulfillment is also teleological. It's just that it is no longer directed toward something beyond oneself. It rests in oneself. And as a matter of fact, um, I think that that is symbolically expressed again in the first chapter of Genesis, where God rests on the seventh day. So after having created the world that is very good, um, God has satisfied God's teleological creative drive and is at rest in the seventh day. And the seventh day expresses their perfection that that and here's where there's a certain paradox or irony, the perfection that is even entailed in imperfection. And what I mean by
Mm.
that is that I mean the analogy that I would use is a football game. You know, uh, the there has to be a challenge in a football game in order for the football game to be interesting. So you can't just confer a victory on a team without it having to work toward that victory. Otherwise, the victory itself would not be satisfying. And so, um, and so, there's a sense in which even the dissatisfaction of the pursuit can, if you step back far enough and recognize that that dissatisfaction is going to ultimately result in satisfaction, there's a satisfaction even in knowing that. And that's what
Huh,
I
interesting. Kind of a divine dissatisfaction could be the summum bonum of the human being. I'm dissatisfied with the things that pass. I'm dissatisfied with any choice less than that of the highest virtue, which shows us as having this dual nature. That's why I love your allusion to the beginning of Genesis, which works both in Jewish and Christian thought traditions. God begins in a state of eternal perfection with no change, maybe if we're not process theologians, then creates a world which is not complete and in process and falls away, as Genesis describes archetypically, right? And then on the seventh day, the Sabbath, Shabbat, prefigures a final rest or final state where there is no more change, or what's Revelation say, and there will be no more tears.
yes,
And so
but
the human, so that's easy for God, but you've got an understanding where the human being also tastes maybe on Shabbat or something that rest, that place of perfection
yeah,
without
that's it.
change.
Right. The distinction is not simply temporal. It's a spiritual level. There's spiritual levels, right? So there is the level of work, the level of the 6 days of work, right? And that goes on, but that level of the 6 days of work, at least ideally, spiritually ideally, is grounded in the level of Shabbat, the sense
Mm.
that there is an ultimate fulfillment that
Yeah.
is ever present, that is eternal, that is not just something that is futural, but is something
Yeah.
that we can actually abide in and rest in now and
That's,
feel
yeah.
a sense of peace in now.
Yeah, that's
And
beautiful. So it's actually that is would actually be the Jewish view that that the 6 days of work have as their telos Shabbat. And Shabbat is
yes,
always finally tied with Messiah and that ultimate. But I'm feeling like, speaking of the ultimate, we should see if our host is satisfied or wants to drag us in a different direction.
So yeah, I've been thinking. So God would have to be outside of space and time. It's space and time in itself. It's moving. It's everything that exists within God. So God shapes everything. It's just the body of God, as it were, moving and creating and flourishing within a temporal construct. But he himself would transcend time because time exists within it. That's how I conceptualize it. And because of that, he's already complete. But then because he's infinite and omnipotent, uh, it wouldn't just be him existing. I mean, he's everything, but he can create something separate from himself. So this is where we come in, other souls, us, animals, everything else. And it's almost like parts of him, almost like spies that begin from a tabula rasa and go on a journey, maybe like an adventure to a mental construct, which would be our world, our reality, which is lacking, but that provides opportunity to move towards the infinite. So, and that way, it also tells a story to the souls that go on this adventure, and also to God Himself. It's almost like, but at the same time, it's not a temporal story. I think Thomas Aquinas made reference to this when he spoke about causation in his five ways. And I think Richard Dawkins misrepresented him in the God delusion. I used to buy into the God delusion, but now I see that it's actually a straw man of Thomas Aquinas. So it's almost like God is so beyond human comprehension that is actually everywhere, but he allows us to go on a journey, a temporal journey, and to experience free will. So we have our own free will, and there's so many ways in which we can do things within this reality, and we are free and limited, but it provides opportunities for us. But it's almost like he's already aware of everything. He's omniscient, and but at the same time, he's simple, and because he's omniscient, he's unchanging. So we can't quite comprehend the mind of God. So it doesn't change. Perhaps it's consciousness itself. It doesn't change. It's just aware. It's alive. It's living. And when it goes on a journey, it begins to experience wants and wishes, and it becomes teleological. Like you guys were saying, we experience teleology, but for God, it's already, you go on an adventure at the end of which you may return to me, transcendence. I'll give you a big hug, everything's okay, no more tears. It's something like that. I just wonder if Thomas Aquinas was on the right track, if Paul Tillich himself was on the right track. I mean, I think both of them agreed on the what is it? Ipsum esse subsistence. So God is being in and of itself. So
Yeah.
and I wonder if that, because his being, his existence itself, if that also allows for God to be a kind of being that transcends all beings, or maybe it's not possible for us to view it that way because it would be defining God, and maybe that's blasphemous, or it to us we could see it as an insult,
So,
but to God he wouldn't see it as an insult because you're
yeah,
allowed to express yourselves,
so you've
free
just
will.
come to one of the really key questions of this entire theme that we're exploring. I'm only going to formulate the question and then see where Richard starts taking it. It looks like if there is an ultimate, say, a personal God, a God that is um, the ultimate and relies on nothing else, and it has the characteristics of being personal, then one of the defining debates for me in 1799 with Fichte is called the Atheismusstreit, the atheism debate. And he argued in an essay that a personal being can't be ultimate. Personal means intrinsically to be in relation with others than itself. So it looks, and this is why I'm turning to Richard, it looks like we have a dilemma if if God's personal, then God can't be ultimate and above all other things. If God is um, not that, then God exists intrinsically in relations with others. And that's one of the hardest dilemmas, I would say, in the history of Western thought,
Could
especially
I just say
theology. But
Oh,
let's
something?
see where Richard goes.
that's
Okay,
first of all, that's a wonderful
I
question.
just want to say
And
something. Is it possible that it could be personal and transpersonal, and because of that, it could also send a guide or shine a light on the best way in which we could live out this earthly life through the body of Jesus. So Jesus would be the perfect example. Jesus' life is the perfect example of how we could
But Arlinda,
endure
you've moved to
trials and
theology,
tribulations,
but you're
right?
the one who gave us the task of doing the philosophy first and the theology in light of that discussion. And in the philosophical critique of theism, that is, in my opinion, number one, the hardest problem we face, which is why I turned to Richard to answer it.
Yeah, go for it, Richard.
oh,
Sorry,
I
yeah.
mean, it's actually it's interesting, Philip, and it's something that I've actually been thinking about lately. So,
Okay.
let me give you some of my thoughts on it. Yes, I think that I mean Paul Tillich once again, who I keep referring to, um, says somewhere in a number of places actually that God cannot be viewed as a person, but that God cannot be viewed as less than personal. So we have to figure out what both of those things can possibly mean. Yes, God cannot be viewed as a person for the very reason, Philip, that I think that you just laid out, which is that persons are ontologically separated from one another. They are distinct. I am not you, and you are not me. And God, as the foundation of being, must transcend the separation between persons. And so, if God transcends the separation between persons, if God encompasses both sides of the personal relationship, then God cannot be a person, distinct from every other person. And I think that's absolutely true. Um, but then we can ask the question, well, does that mean that God is impersonal? Um, and when we think of the impersonal, what we conjure up in our minds are are thing-like entities, are utilitarian things, forces that have no that only have that we cannot enter into a personal relationship with. Okay, so I think that what we end up with, and what the religions are pointing us to, is a God that simply defies the distinction between between well let me maybe put it a different way. Um, a God that is sui generis, who is like nothing else in our reality. Because God is on the one hand, and I like the word transpersonal. God is not simply a person, but God is the ground and basis of our personal relations. Um, and I think who is it that says this may be a paraphrase? God is nearer to us than we are to ourselves. That's Augustine.
Augustine, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Augustine says something along those lines. So if God is nearer to us than we are to ourselves, then that means that God is the basis of our existence, while also being the basis of the existence of any other persons with whom we are in relation. And therefore, God is not simply another person. Um, but we
Okay.
nevertheless, I mean, what we have to do, it seems to me, is ask ourselves, what are the concerns of personhood? In other words, what is it that we long for in longing for personal relationship? And I think that one of the things that we long for is the completion or the satisfaction of this lack
Hmm.
that we're speaking of. And I think that
Beautiful.
satisfaction of that lack takes place most fully in the love relation. Um, and in some sense, the love relation is also paradoxical because lovers are both united with one another and also separated from one another, but separated in their union and united in their separation. Um, And so the question of whether God is personal becomes the question of whether it is possible to enter into a relation of love with God. Um,
Hmm.
and um, and I think if we can answer that question, yes, then we can say to ourselves, on the one hand, God is not to be envisioned as a person who is separate from us. But on the other hand, God can be envisioned as that with which or into which we can enter into a relation of love that satisfies our sense of ontological deficiency. And so
Mm.
that's, I guess, how I would try and answer that
So
question.
I think the answer is great ontologically, so philosophically, theologically, and also existentially. So it meets the three criteria that our Lindo has laid down for us. That's almost precisely the view that I hold, with just one exception I want to mention. Steve Knapp and I published it in the Predicament of Belief, which was some years ago our attempt to understand what, in light of all the reasons not to believe, can we still affirm? And we came to a position very similar to yourself. I love the emphasis on love at the very end. I think that ties the pieces together. The only part that worries me, and I think this is part of our agenda for today, is ground of personhood. Because when I think of Tillich's way of dealing with his fantastic grasp of contingency and his forcing theologians to take contingency with full seriousness through partly because of his inspiration by Heidegger. And then how does he preserve the notion of God? It's well known to both of you. There's the God who's caught up in that contingency, but then there's der Gott über dem Gott des Deismus, the God above the God of theism. Um, but when you look at that, it turns out to be like Spinoza's one, or Plotinus's ultimate, or others in the mystical tradition, which move beyond all cataphatic properties to an apophatic one above all else. And I think it's that conception of the God above the God of theism versus the God of theism that is behind his uh, uh, language. God is not a person, but the ground of personhood. A
Right.
ground is not personal. So it's not just that it isn't a person, it's generally not seen as personal. It's the ground of personhood, but not itself personal. And
Well,
my worry is that that way of conceiving it doesn't do justice to the beauty of everything else that you said.
the way that I end up approaching all of this is, for me, is to finally say that I think that the actual denotative, if we could put it this, denotative metaphysics of God are beyond our cognitive capacity to really grasp. I'm a very Kantian in that respect.
Huh,
I think
interesting. I didn't know that about you.
our cognitive categories are not sufficient. We can't understand, for instance, how temporality emerges out of eternity. I mean, it just there's no way of making sense of that to me in an intellectually satisfying manner. Um, and there's a reason for that because of the category of causality has certain qualities that can't be actually applied to the notion of eternity. Um, so then the question really becomes a phenomenological one, which is what is the way in which we can think about God that preserves what is essential to faith? And um, and I think that there's once again there's this sort of paradox. Um, if God is the ground of being, then God is the ground of my being, right? But if God is the ground of being, then God is also the ground of your being, and you are not me. And so God is both same and other. God
Hmm.
is both me and not me at the same time. And that actually gives rise to two different approaches to the divine. One is the unitive approach or the mystical approach of trying to enter into the depths of my own ground and somehow have an experience of the unity of all being. And of course, we get this in mystics like Meister Eckhart and in the Eastern mystics.
So this should be the apophatic, right, Richard? That part, that
Yeah.
approach.
The
Beyond.
apophat. Yeah, it's beyond categories, and one enters into a sense of unity with all of being, right? Or the subject-object distinction is transcended. Um,
This would be
and
hernosis, wouldn't it?
what's
Is,
that?
is it the concept of hernosis? So you transcend and you move towards the one and you merge with the one. That's called
Yeah,
hernosis,
it
isn't it?
is
Yeah.
a kind of
Like a
yeah,
unity,
it
yeah.
is yeah, it's I associate this with the mystical urge. Um, but I also think that given that we can understand God to be the other, right? The and the bridge in some sense that links us to others. We can enter into an I-thou relationship with God, right? To think of Martin Buber, that God is the eternal thou. God is that other with which we can enter into an intimate personal communion. Um, I mean, what exactly, exactly to try and work out the metaphysics of all this, I'll frankly admit, I think is beyond me. I'm not sure it's not beyond everybody, but I think it's beyond us to work out the specific metaphysics of it. But I think that these two forms of spirituality, we can call them the unitive and the relational, both have validity. They both are true forms of spirituality. And in fact, they're ultimately complementary because, because it is precisely insofar as God is the basis of my being and the basis of your being, and therefore the bridge between us, that God is the medium through which love can take place. And so we can think of God as the medium of love between people, and we can also think of God as the ground of love upon which we can rest. Um,
Mhm.
and I think both of those things are legitimate modes of spirituality.
Mhm.
Um,
So I love your focus on the spiritual. You're using theological resources and making the notion of relationship central. I feel like I should respond like the philosopher who's very drawn to this, but formulates each of the two sides of your answer in a slightly different way. So we started talking about Tillich's notion of the ground of personhood. You introduced yourself as a Kantian, so this difference between what we grasp, categories of causality and so forth, and whatever the ultimate is. So if we're Kantian, that means that what we say about the ultimate, the noetic, the Dinge an sich, things in themselves, is absolutely nothing. It's an X. It's a complete unknown, which Feuerbach later pushed on him. And so it's the mystic who says, I am having these experiences, but I'm not making philosophical claims. I'm not claiming to know the conceptual nature of the ultimate because of this, as it were, Kantian or experiential or mystical or apophatic, this distinction between what we know and what ultimately is. So on the first half of your answer, I would make it a stricter um, apophasis, that which cannot be said. What was the end of the Tractatus in Wittgenstein, Tractatus 7.0? That whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent,
right.
or use emotive words or sing songs or love others or something. On the
But you
other
said we're,
half,
yeah.
so let me just do the other half more briefly, was the relational, and you described it in relational terms. But it seems to me that the philosopher does not have to be silent there or go home with his tail between his legs, because he can say, well, a relational way of thinking is what we in the philosophical tradition call a dialectical way of thinking, one that has an other, both itself and an other resolve somehow into relationship. I'm thinking of Hegel, but there are many, many ways to put it. And so your relational invites the philosopher in, whether it's a theory of personhood or a theory of dialectical reasoning or whatever it might be. And so I'm close to you, but with those differences may or may not be significant as we proceed.
Yeah, what I guess the direction that I would want to go in is to say that philosophy is invited into both of those.
Ah, okay.
Um, and um, and I guess I would amend Wittgenstein's famous saying to say that that of which we cannot speak insofar as it is important is is that of which we must speak as best we can, while recognizing the inadequacy of our speech. I mean,
Sweet.
the funny thing about the Tao Te Ching, right, is
Yeah.
it begins with the line, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao," and then proceed to speak about it, right? The whole Tao Te Ching is speaking about the Tao that cannot be spoken of. Um,
Well, I have a
and
lot to say on that one, but I think I should hand off to our host and see where he wants to take us.
Okay, sure, yeah.
But that's
Yeah,
interesting. We've outlined positions that are similar, complementary, but not identical. And I think that's fascinating. Arlindo.
which makes me wonder if our dialectical interaction is a way in which we're engaging with the logos, and I wonder if we can touch upon that concept because what is the logos? It's is it the word of God? Has it got something to do with logic, reason, intellect? It's something like that, isn't it? And it's got something to do with in theology. It's got something to do with Jesus Christ as well, the Word made flesh. I mean, what can you guys tell me about that? Because right now we're trying to get somewhere. We're trying to understand, come to some kind of understanding, and we're refining ideas, aren't we? So there is a kind of teleology about it. We're moving somewhere. You know, someone presents a thesis, you know, someone comes up with an antithesis, and then there's a synthesis. And this synthesis is supposed to be an improved understanding between the interlocutors um, until that understanding is challenged again. You know, we can only um, we can only strive towards something perfect, but in the end, we should also be open to other possibilities, and we should be humble, and that allows for progress, like I said before. But this concept of logos or however you want to say it, I know you have a different pronunciation. Um, What is it, and why is it that we have? I know Aristotle viewed it as a mode of persuasion, didn't he? And I think it's probably the best mode of persuasion because it brings you facts. It emphasizes reason. It's it doesn't. There's no possibility of being deceptive or lying about it. You know, the other modes of persuasion, you get pathos, and I think it's got something to do with appealing to emotion. Someone could try to persuade another person of something. You know, this person is trying to make a point which could be deceptive, but they end up using uh, an emotional story which isn't happening everywhere, but it's actually just one example amongst several. But they could, especially in politics, they could be trying to use that narrative, just one example of a narrative, to try and persuade the other person that it's actually happening everywhere. So it allows for deception, pathos, and then there's ethos, which is more it appeals to credentials. You know, this must be true because so and so said it, and they actually know what they're talking about. They're an expert. So you should be paying attention to that. Who are you to say otherwise? Because you don't have the credentials. You don't know what you're talking about. So there's it's not sufficient to arrive at the truth, But when you're talking about logos, it's there's no denying it. It just brings you the facts. It's about truth, isn't it? And I wonder if truth is also a facet of God, or if it's God himself at the same time. I mean, if he's everything, and it's about virtue, isn't it? You know, you get the seven deadly sins, but you also get the seven deadly, not deadly. You also get the seven virtues, and these
Hmm.
virtues, I think most people would agree, are good. They are pointing towards the good, something that
Well,
will,
Arlindo, how are you connecting how are you in your mind connecting the idea of logos with the virtues?
because I think that consciousness is an awareness that wants to, has a will, and when it comes up with concepts, and if it identifies with something, if it forms an identity to try and describe itself, it forms a narrative about itself, and then that concept relates to other concepts, it begins to form like a web of conceptual reality. Not this, not that. I'm not that. I'm not this. I'm similar to that. And it becomes immersed in something finite. And then it wants to feel good. It wants to improve. It wants to, I think the concept of eudaimonia comes into it. It wants to be in good spirits. It's kind of like a spiritual welfare that it wants to move towards. It loves itself and therefore it cares about itself. Um, Actually, my battery's running low. I'm going to have to plug this in. I can't believe it's not.
Well, let's let Richard, while you're doing that, maybe Richard should jump in and see
Yeah,
where else to
yeah,
go with the
jump in
logos.
and see
Yeah.
what you can.
Well,
See if I
I'll
can.
be happy to jump in. Although, Philip, would you like to take on the question of logos here?
No, I want to see
I'll
where
be
you
happy
start
to.
because there's so many
Okay.
different ways that leads. I want to see what focus it plays for you.
I um I guess that my way of understanding what logos refers to in the Christian tradition is is the pattern, that which is inherent within the divine, that provides for the pattern or the
Mhm.
fundamental structure of reality, of the created reality. So the logos is that which creates the great diversity,
Mhm.
um, and uh, and I think that once again I think of this from Tillich's standpoint. He distinguishes between essence and existence. So the logos is the repository, so to speak, of the essences
Mhm.
of what God intends for the world to be, or how the world might be, uh, insofar to the extent that the world were meeting its divine teleology, its divine purpose. So
Mhm.
this is the logos. Um, and therefore the logos gives rise to um, the law, right? Out of the logos comes the prophetic law that says this is how people should behave, and if you behave in this manner, then you will be living in accordance with the divine purpose. And so we get that from the prophets and that the Ten Commandments and so forth. And in the Christian tradition, of course, the logos is thought to be perfectly manifest, at least the human logos, in the person of Jesus, um, who is the paradigm, in some sense, the living paradigm of what a human being should be, so as to live in perfect communion with the divine. And it is in that sense that it is said that Jesus is the Logos made flesh. Um, so that's my general understanding of it.
Mhm. Um, I struggle with the trying to nail down in a philosophical way the notion of logos because so much gets built into it. Arlindo started with describing logos, and his answer moved out to ethics and to ways of living and to value and eudaimonia and so forth. In the same way, you started talking about logos, and that it includes the model, includes the thing that we strive for, sort of a moral idea, and it includes a person in that person's life in the Christian tradition, right? In the beginning was the logos, and and then verse 14, it was manifest in the birth of Jesus in John 1. Um, so I begin to run out of a framework that as a philosopher it'll stay clear enough in my hands without dissolving into everything and nothing. So if I was going to try to be clear, fair to logos in the New Testament, I suppose I would want to use a Hebrew notion, a Hebrew Bible notion from the Christian Old Testament, Genesis, the notion of being made in the image of God. So
Hmm.
I'm there in the skepticism in the back of my mind is this famous passage at the beginning of Goethe's Faust, and Faust is sitting there trying to translate John 1:1. In the beginning was a logos, and he says, "Well, would that be?" And it's obviously it's in German, but it translates pretty well. Would it be word? No, I can't just be that. Would it be? And he tries out all the possibilities, and he says, "Well, finally." Am Anfang war die Tat. In the beginning was the deed or the act. And if anything, that's a fair kind of um, translation. But just to see all the things that it can include. So if you're going to think in terms of the nature of the Christian tradition, wouldn't you say that there's something in the nature of the God as creator? There's something in the nature of God as manifest. This is also imago Dei. God is walking the dusty back roads of Palestine, of Galilee, right? And there's
Yes,
something in God is present in everything. So I've just given the description of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, all of which is logos understood as imago Dei.
absolutely. And that's exactly how I understand it anyway, that Christ is a revelation of the human being who is perfectly conformed to the image of God,
Yeah.
which is, of course, how the human being is said to be made, right, in the very first chapter of Genesis. So then we have this idea, and what is expressed, it seems to me, in the first chapter is is the logos, the word of God, right? God creates through the word. God says, "Let there be light, let there be this, and let there be that." So it is through the word, through the logos, that God creates. But then, and here's where Tillich's insight comes in. There's something about the existentiality of the logos, right?
Mhm.
Once it is embodied in actual existence, um, it becomes much more problematic. It's
Mhm.
uh, I guess I mean the image might be if Beethoven writes this beautiful symphony and it's perfect on paper, right? I mean, the symphony as written in notes on paper is perfect, but when it comes to be played by an orchestra, so then it merely strives for that perfection. And so the
Mm.
creation can at best strive for the perfection that the logos represents. Um, and so in that respect, Christ then is the ultimate, from a Christian point of view, of course, the ultimate revelation
Yeah.
of the fulfillment of the, to use the word again, teleology inherent within the logos.
Your answer ties together several parts of today's conversation really nicely. Um, it takes us back to that existential note that was in Arlinda's opening challenge to us and that both of us brought in our responses. But it also takes us back to Tillich, who is famous for the distinction between the essential and the existential. And so we might say that the logos is a kind of um, essential quality. It belongs up in this realm of like ground of personhood and this realm of the God above the God of theism. Existence is what we live in every day. And a lot of interpreters of the three volumes of his systematic theology recognize how difficult it actually turns out to be as you get into his theology of culture and so forth, to have this essential element do very much, because he really becomes a student of culture, a reader of the mid 20th century. And the existential, I think, is what has grabbed so many people and made Tillich of enduring significance inside and outside of the Christian tradition. The part about Tillich that is, voiced already in 1949 with the courage to be. So where does that
Yeah,
take you? In other words, the logo stays, but it becomes more like that realm of the apophatic that you talked about in the Kantian part of your previous answer. And
yeah.
it's the
Um,
existential that does the work. What do you think?
yeah, no, I think that they're both essential. Both the existential and the essential are
Uh-huh.
essential to the whole story, right? And the idea, Tillich's notion of the essential bears a strong analogy, of course, to Plato's notion of the ideas.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
uh, and they are as things should be. They represent the realm not of what is existentially, but what should be, what everything is teleologically ordered to.
Would you
And
speak of that as in Kantian terms as regulative principles? Or are you going to be metaphysical about it?
yeah, well, I mean, this gets into some very nuanced uh, vocabulary in a sense.
Okay.
I'm not perfectly satisfied with the notion of regulative principle, um, because that is an epistemological uh, um, um, description in a sense. In other words, that's the best way we can think of it. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's. I feel that there's a sense in which we ought to believe in the metaphysics of
Okay.
this.
I thought that's where you were going. Whether it's the essential, which is part of your answer, or whether it's the God above the God of theism as really being as a metaphysical entity, or your adherence to a kind of Platonic forms understanding of logos. So you're not
Yeah,
shy about leaving Kant behind when it comes to these
yeah. Well,
questions.
here's what it is. I mean, when I spoke of myself as a Kantian, I'm not a dogmatic Kantian or a dogmatic anything. Um, and for me, the Kantian nature of my thought is really just a kind of intellectual humility.
Hmm.
I mean, that's really what it amounts to. It's not, I think there's a dryness that takes place if you take Kant too dogmatically, that we can't know anything. I do believe that there's a place for faith, and that faith is real. And Kant, of course, himself says, "I've had to do away with knowledge to make room for faith."
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so I think that there is a place in spiritual life for the affirmation of faith, for saying, I can't know that this is absolutely true. My cognitive ability is not capable of knowing this with certainty, but this is what I place my faith in. I
hmm,
I accept this, and I approach it. I sometimes call it Socratic faith.
nice.
Socrates, of course, is famous for saying, "I know that I don't know," but that doesn't prevent him and Plato from asserting that there are certain ways that human beings ought to live, right? Um, it just allows him to say, this is as far as I understand right now. I am open to the possibility that I'm open to correction. I'm open to
Mm.
dialogue. I'm open to dialectic. But nevertheless, this is what I place my faith in for now. And
This is a fascinating moment in this discussion. I think it goes back to the reason that Lindo brought us together in the beginning. I'm actually hearing three positions, and I think I would inhabit the third. Um, so there's the dogmatic metaphysician, as you described him or her, who just really, we know that this is the ultimate. We know that this is the framework. Uh, we see that in philosophy and theology on a regular basis. There's the purely apophatic, or the strictly Kantian, maybe, where we don't really know anything at all about it, and in a sense, we shouldn't even be talking about it, like the Wittgenstein, we shouldn't speak of it notion that we talked about earlier. And in between is a place where there's an orientation to a ground of being. It's interesting, and this comes closer to my reading of Tillich, which might not be yours, that after these strong statements in volume one, he really becomes a student of culture who never loses the intentionality of focus on a something, the ground of being, the um, ground of personhood, the God above the God, of messed up, complex gods of the various traditions, but whatever that thing above is. And it seems to me he finds a beautiful space in between what I've just somewhat stereotypically called the Platonic and the Kantian, inviting us to reflect on that, inviting us to live it out, inviting us to keep it as an orientation, but being
yes,
very cautious about, as so-called cataphatic statements, knowledge claiming statements about it.
yes.
That's where your answer took me to. I don't know if it's what you intended.
No, that's wonderful. That was a wonderful way of formulating what I think is where I stand, which is this in between place.
Nice.
That we can robustly um, express a sense of faith, right? We can go to church and get on our knees and take the Eucharist and robustly commit ourselves to that,
Mhm.
while at the same time recognizing a certain humility, having a certain basic humility, and saying this is the best I can come up with right now.
Yeah.
But I'm open to dialogue. I'm open to reflection. I'm open to possibly somebody enlightening me or illuminating me in such a way
It,
that I
it's
will move to
that's
a
right.
higher level of understanding.
It's
Yeah.
modes of
So I
engagement,
want to
isn't it?
invite Lindo back in, but let me just say a closing word on this
Sure.
before you take us to our next chapter of this conversation. As a comparative theologian, I'm struck with how well this both and position is done in multiple religious traditions. Uh, so for Judaism, you don't have to believe in God to be a devout Jew. You can have lots of understandings, including doubts about God, and still carry that out in the action of the mitzvot, the laws. In Islam, there are 100 named characteristics of God in one thinker, and most of them are apophatic. We can't
Hmm.
fully know. And some of the most beautiful Islamic theology is done by mystics like Ibn Sina, or poets, right? Like Rumi.
Hmm.
And it's in Zen Buddhism. We could do it in the Tao. I hold a slightly different position of interpreting Tao Te Ching, but I'll just
Uh,
close with Advaita Vedanta, or well, just the classic schools of Vedanta in Hinduism, because they will make statements about Brahman and the ultimate, but couched in mystical language that sort of gives with the one hand and takes away with the other. And the tradition marches that line between the apophatic and unknowable and the cataphatic and overly domesticated with a grace and a beauty that is among the most incredible in all the religious traditions.
Yes, and one way of analyzing this, or taking this just a little bit further, would be to talk about how a dogmatic apophatism, if we can call it that,
Sweet.
and a dogmatic cataphatism, I don't know if those are the right words, um, run into all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
create all kinds of problems. In a sense, if you become too apophatic, um, that lead to a kind of nihilism.
Hmm.
You can't affirm anything, and there's no basis for affirming anything. And so that collapses the spiritual urge. It doesn't
Hmm.
um, it doesn't have an object any longer.
Hmm.
Um, uh, John Hick, just to, there are places. John Hick, of course, is a very accomplished um, pluralist, religious pluralist. Right? There are places where he says, "Well, we can't even say that God is good." I think that goes too far, right? Because if God is not good, then God is not God. If you're going to speak of God, then you must speak of God as good. So the apophatic can lead to a collapse, a kind of nihilistic collapse, if it's taken too extremely. And the cataphatic, of course, can lead to a kind of oppressive dogmatism and
Scholasticism.
legalism uh, and um, and authoritarianism. That you must believe this, and if you don't believe this, then you're going to be in trouble. Um, and so that's those are in a sense spiritual reasons
Hmm.
why we need to find a middle ground between those two positions.
Very nicely put. Arlinda, where do you want to take us?
Yeah, I was going to say we should always be humble. There is definitely something to faith, and when we think about ethics, morality, it for me it begins to take on a religious dimension. Um, and we may take inspiration from great theologians and philosophers, um, but there is a sense in which we shouldn't be we shouldn't be scared of the mystical of these experiences. And I mean, we have a perfect example in the life of Thomas Aquinas, don't we? Because he had an experience where he was made to feel like his work was like straw. It's like it's nothing compared to that altered state. One wonders if he experienced something divine and he just thought my life's work isn't all that really, isn't that much, even though it's so influential even today. I mean, it's the basis for the Catholic canon, or is supposed to be the major one of the major influences of Catholicism, isn't he? And but there is something I came across recently which I
He's
didn't
the
know about.
angelic doctor.
Yeah,
The
that's
angelic
right. Yeah,
doctor.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, angelic doctor. Everyone talks about the straw experience that he had, but recently I came across something that he also experienced before he died, and it was that he went inside a church and he saw an image of Jesus Christ, and the image spoke to him, and it said, "You have written well about me. How would you like to
Hmm.
be rewarded?" And he said, "With your presence, my Lord."
Hmm.
And uh, a lot of people might think, "Oh, this is just ridiculous," especially the atheist types. But for me, I think it's really profound because, Christ is supposed to be the truth, the way, and the life, isn't he? And for him to see that, I'm wondering if God, which yes, transcends personhood, is also existence itself and alive and aware. And in that moment, it actually spoke to him and through the image of Jesus Christ. And even though it asked him a question, it's not like he didn't know how Thomas Aquinas would answer. It's almost like a revelation. Like
Hmm.
he experienced the question that incited him to see the
Yeah.
revelation. The answer was the answer to himself. and it speaks to, and I think Tillich does a good job in coming up with the method of correlation because it brings in psychology. There's definitely an element of human psychology, and then we have to take a look at uh, scripture. The church history, everything needs to be taken into account because there is so much there. But in that moment, I think it was a revelation to him. Not that God is supposed to be omniscient. It's not that God was wondering how would he like to be rewarded, but that he incited a revelation in Thomas Aquinas, which was, you know, the reward is to find Christ, to find, because Christ is the way, and yeah. And I wonder if some philosophers they get so bogged down with ideas and language and concepts that they end up denying, supernaturalism or mystical experiences or a sense of the numinous. Whereas some, towards the end of their lives, they kind of start focusing on the mystical more, because maybe it's to do with not just reason, but I think God transcends reason itself, at least human reason, and it speaks to the soul, you know, to felt experience. I don't know. What do you
Do you
guys
guys
think?
think there might be a continuum? So I'm thinking of Richard's sort of endpoints, the dogmatic mystic or apophatic and the dogmatic philosopher that you just described. But I wonder if there can be a certain leaning. So I think of the philosopher theologian that Richard probably knows at Boston University, Wesley Wildman, and um, he did these comparative studies of metaphysics across the traditions, and then between 2010 and 2012 published 13 maybe a trilogy of books that basically defended um, uh, an apophaticism. All the words fall short, but one that grew out of a brilliant metaphysical research program that involved the Western traditions as well as traditions of the East. So that the words and concepts and intellectual work of Wesley Wildman is very strong, but the final thrust is a kind of absolute apophatic, that nothing is actually known.
Yeah.
He would say it doesn't go to the dogmatic side that both of you are pointing out. So, Richard, the idea of a continuum from, you know, overstating to knowing nothing, which might vary by context and generation and personality and something. I've never thought of
Yeah,
that before.
well, it's funny that you mentioned Wesley Wildman. I don't know him very well personally at all. I've met him on a couple of occasions, but we had a little dialogue at the American Academy of Religion conference in Boston about this very
Hmm.
issue. Um, um, so anyway, but yeah, I mean, what this calls to mind is the question of revelation, I guess, for me. How does revelation function? Um, I think that there's humility is once again the word that I keep coming back to because there's a deep insecurity at the bottom of human existence, right? This is what Heidegger speaks about. This is what Tillich talks about as the our subjection to non-being. It creates a great anxiety,
Hmm.
and one of the ways in which we try to resolve that anxiety, I think, is to cling to some idea that feels like it is foundational, that now we know, where we're not comfortable within the uncertainty. And so we strive for some kind of certainty, and that itself ends up leading us into these kind of distorted behaviors, distorted directions. Um, so this again is where something like, for me, something like faith comes in. Um, because in order to address that anxiety, I don't think we can address it. At least I can only speak for myself. I can't convince myself that my metaphysical knowledge is and understanding is sufficient for me to know, be able to prove beyond any doubt that God exists, or that love is ultimate, or that any of the things that I desire and even require for my own sense of inner peace are metaphysically true. I can't. I don't have the. I can't read a book. I can go through Hegel, but he doesn't do that for me. Um, and so, what is required is faith, which is a trust. It's a kind of basic trust. Now, can that trust be ultimately proved to be misplaced? Yeah, I can't deny that. But nevertheless, one recognizes that 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 it is good to trust in the ultimate goodness of being, and that one is rooted in and grounded in something that is ultimately good. And that trust then allows one not to completely eliminate all the anxiety of life, but to tolerate it, to bear it with humility. Um, and that's what allows us to stay in that middle space, I think, so that we can then move toward a greater and greater understanding.
Mm.
I don't know if I've answered the question that you
No,
were
that's
asking.
that's good. I actually want to just build on it. I've been working on one of the most fascinating books of my life with my co-author Steve Knapp over the last 4 or 5 years, trying to understand the nature of hope. We live in a period where there's so much hopelessness surrounding us, whether it's the failure of democracy or um, are ruining the planet for future generations or whatever one's concern is, or AI or chat rooms, or right, there's 1,000 reasons to be hopeless. And um, we ended up, the book is Hope Beyond Belief and will be appearing soon. We ended up finding that this notion of trust that you talked about, or faith as trust, um, can be grounded in two different things. So it can be grounded in beliefs, and sometimes those beliefs are taken as certain. I'm thinking of Romans 4, where the New Testament Paul uses the word hope against hope. Abraham hoped against hope and therefore, set out. Um, uh, so that with an unwavering faith, what is it? Hebrews 1, the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. So assurance and conviction, faith really grounded in firm beliefs. But if you take the Greek word for hope, elpisis, so use the adjective elpidic, there can be hope grounded trust. As we say, my son never returns the car keys. He comes home late at night. He leaves them somewhere. I have to go to work at 6 a.m. I can't find the car keys. And one night again, he asks, "Can I take the car out tonight?" And I don't really believe he's going to put them in the right place, but I hope it. And so I give him the keys again. My trust is based on hope, not knowledge. And I
Mhm.
I wonder whether that could be a way that we understand some of these questions we're talking about. I have a hope that things will move in this direction. I have a hope-based trust or a hope-based faith in the outcome, which
Yes,
doesn't
and
make strong epistemic claims.
and of course this is directly related to what Aquinas calls the theological virtues,
Yeah,
which are faith, hope, and love,
yeah.
right? And and my understanding again is that the hope is not some arbitrary hope.
Yeah.
It's a hope that is rooted, it is the hope is the affirmation of our teleological thrust. In other
Hmm.
words, that is inherent to our being that we find within ourselves.
Hmm.
So that
Nice.
the failure of hope, which is, after all, the failure of hope in an ultimate sense, is despair,
Yeah.
right? The failure of hope is a kind of self-negation.
Hmm.
Um,
Beautifully put.
and,
Beautifully put.
um, and so faith is, in one sense, is that kind of dialectical, I guess, and this is, I think, what you were saying, that in some sense, hope demands faith. Hope demands faith that the hope can be satisfied. Otherwise, the hope is no longer hope. It's no longer living hope. If you don't have any faith that the hope can be fulfilled, it's
Yeah.
not really hope. And on the other hand, um, well, this is just the other side of the coin. The faith that the hope can be satisfied is what gives the hope vitality.
Hmm.
Um, and so, uh, and so the faith grounds the hope, and the hope grounds the faith, and they both are really a single thing that each needs the other in order to be fulfilled.
Hmm.
Um, and But they are all rooted in our nature. It's not just an arbitrary hope. It's a hope that is ultimately a self-affirmation.
Except
Um,
I have second order hope that faith or those my beliefs about the nature of human being are accurate. So I don't know those either. So do you notice that at each step of your argument, that can be grounded in the my hope it's true or in a certainty of knowledge that it's true,
yeah,
all the way up the scale.
yeah, and it's yeah, we have to hope that our hope, well, it's a kind of tautology almost. We have to hope that our hope has ha,
No, I meant it
has
different though, Richard, though.
validity.
I meant whenever we move to a faith claim or a knowledge claim, we don't leave the elpedic dimension out. There's always, it's never fully known. Whichever part of today's conversation, whichever proposition one of us has spoken over the last hour and a half, we don't know for sure. And so there might be an element of hope that lets us, how can I say, cling to it, even when we're not sure that Kierkegaard's famous notion of being suspended 70,000 leagues over uh, the leagues fathoms over the water. We don't know
Yes,
for sure that there's a foundation there in the divine. There's an element of hope, which is why the tradition calls it a theological virtue, which means it's pervasive across theology, as are love and faith.
yes, and of course, if we understand that the faith and the hope, what is the faith in and what is the hope for? It's a hope for entering into this ultimate experience of love. I mean, that's the end of it,
Yeah.
and so I think that for the person of faith, for the devout person of faith who has gone through this in a deep way, um, the more that they experience that sense of love as foundational to them, the more they feel that their hope is fulfilled. So they
Hmm.
do have some sense that, that they can grow in that hope can become something of a firm confidence, not because we can work it out metaphysically, but because we ourselves experience in our own inner lives the satisfaction of that hope.
Hmm.
So there is a
Nice.
sense in which knowledge is a belief. It's a subset of belief. The more confident you are in your belief, the more you feel like you have knowledge of that. And I was thinking, is there a sense in which a scientist has faith that there's a truth to be found? Even a scientist like, say, Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, when he does research, as a scientist within the context of evolutionary biology, right? Or he has someone to do it for him. He must have a team or something like that. But I think these days he just writes books and talks about his work. But is there a sense in which he obviously talks about making further discoveries about the world? Um, is an atheist, but at the same time, he has to believe that there's a truth to be found. So that's a kind of faith, isn't it? It's more than just hope. It's a faith. Otherwise,
Yeah,
he's got no purpose as a scientist.
yeah. In the religion science discussion, uh, people often make claims of that sort. I'm not sure it's true for everybody who does science. It's not like you're inconsistent if you don't have that ultimate faith. The very project of science itself could be a hypothesis. I don't know that it's true. I want to see how far we can go with empirical methods and the principles of falsification in achieving reliable knowledge of the world. That is, we can act on these things and they hold true. The bridges don't fall down when we build them according to certain
Is
principles.
there a sense in
So,
which,
so again,
yeah,
I
yeah,
just put it into
yeah,
philosophy. This is actually a fascinating frame for our topic. Let's say, where can I start? On the far left, so left as you would see it, we would have skeptic or pure pragmatist, like Richard Rorty. Probably Dewey would fit in that category. By the time you come to C.S. Peirce, it's it's a it's a bid, I guess, a hypothesis that in the long run, our knowledge will turn out to be justified. And then he says at one point, possibly infinite distance of time before the communities of inquiry uh, center in on truth. Start on the other side, Alvin Plantinga, the evangelical philosopher, would say, we know all sorts of things. I know for sure that I had breakfast this morning. And I can know, William Olson said, that I'm being appeared to by God. So there would be knowledge all the way across. Do you see what I mean? So you can be way out there on the limb where you do science and you don't make a knowledge claim. I think that's interesting parallel in terms of our discussion of metaphysics and theology today. But I'll see where it takes you guys.
Yeah, another topic that this then leads us to is, and I think it's very important, is the various distortions that religion is prone to.
Yeah.
Um, and one of those distortions, I think, has to do, especially in the Christian tradition, with the notion that belief is necessary for salvation.
Hmm.
Um, and there's this ambiguity in the word belief, right? Because on the one hand, um, belief is the English version of the word for faith, right, in the New Testament. Um, it's just we don't have a verb form of the word faith in English. Um, but in the New Testament, I believe it's pistis is the word for faith, and pisteuein is the word for to believe. Um, and pistio, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is I believe. So belief in the New Testament really means faith. It doesn't mean the affirmation that certain propositional claims are true. Um, but it gets translated into that in a lot of fundamentalist versions of religion. That you must affirm that Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead, or you must affirm that Jesus was the incarnation of God, or you must affirm that God exists in some sort of propositional sense in order to be saved, so that such belief becomes a necessary condition for salvation. And in this way, religion becomes distorted, um, and it becomes legalistic and fear-based. Um, and so this is one of the problems that we have, I think, and it not only becomes distorted, but it can also be exploited by religious authorities and religious powers that wish to consolidate their power by saying that you've got to go through this gate and make these kinds of moves, and we control the gate in order to be saved, and that creates a tremendous amount of I'd almost call it pathology
Hmm.
within religion,
Yeah,
um,
for sure.
where that people
I,
like yeah, Christopher
I want to see
Hitchens.
how far I could. So picking up on that, and then how far can we go with that? How far can we push it? So obviously, the place to think would be Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard in the mid 19th century. Um, One of his famous formulations about faith in concluding unscientific postscript is it's the objective uncertainty, which fits what we were saying, held fast in an appropriation process of the most passionate inwardness. So lovely combination of objectively speaking, it's uncertain, but with passionate inwardness, I hold fast to it. That's behind the fear and trembling talk of teleological suspension of the ethical. And sometimes, like in Sickness unto Death, he focuses on despair
But what are
in
we
the context
passionately?
of genuine selfhood and faith,
Yeah,
right?
but the question there becomes, what is it that we are passionately holding on to?
Oh, that's interesting
Um,
because I was just thinking of a sentence I just found in from Kierkegaard. Faith is precisely the contradiction between the infinite passion of the individual's inwardness and the objective uncertainty.
yeah, but the problem with that is it doesn't tell us what the passion of inwardness is directed toward. I mean, just
Yeah.
that in that definition in itself. So we need more content. Um, yeah, I think it's a wonderful definition in the sense that yes, there's this objective uncertainty, but at the same time there is an inward or passionate um, conviction that at the same time recognizes the objective uncertainty. But a
Mm.
lot is going to depend upon what the conviction is a conviction of, right? If it's said that well the passionate inwardness or the conviction is a conviction about that certain historical claims about Jesus are true, then I think that becomes a distortion of faith, right?
Mm.
If what you have to passionately hold on to is that Jesus was physically resurrected
Mm.
um, at a certain date in the past, then that's no longer
So,
really
Richard, you
faith.
just gave us a continuum, right? If you hold on to something so specific, that's too much. If you just have passion qua passion, that's too little. What's the golden mean? What's the perfect?
Well, Kierkegaard gives us, and you mentioned it in the Sickness unto Death, he gives us another definition of faith, which I think responds to that, which is faith is the resting transparently in in that which has established us, right?
Mm.
Faith is a resting transparent. I don't have the exact quote in mind, but it is to rest transparently in the power that establishes us. And that
Mm.
power that establishes us is once again the ground of being, the self-subsistent being. And and to rest in that is to trust in that because that's what resting has to mean in
That's
this
beautiful.
context.
So you've just tied together a whole conversation. We may end up ending a few minutes early because in that sentence you referred, so in this inward passion, resting in, you referred to our two major thinkers, Tillich, who we both have discussed, and St. Thomas, who Arlindo has mentioned, right? The uh, the faith or resting in this essential that lies beyond the realm of the existential where we live. Oh, or you gave the citation of the understanding of God from St. Thomas. That's interesting. So we've covered the whole gamut, right? The whole waterfront. And then we've looked at these different philosophical views, these different theological views, and now we came to what is the stance of the individual responding to that, which, by the way, Arlindo, is how you began this whole conversation. And
Yeah,
you took that resting in, but what's the object of the resting in? And you gave us Tillich and St. Thomas. I mean,
yeah,
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's a pretty good, but maybe
yeah.
Arlindo doesn't think it's a good enough synthesis yet.
We've come full circle, I think. Um, there is so much more that we can cover, you know. I think what's interesting about Heidegger, I think it was Heidegger, is how he viewed objects as well, and he viewed it in a teleological manner, didn't he? And I think there's the example of a fork, and he pointed out that we as human beings, we don't view the fork as an object with good stabbing properties. We view it as an in order to eat object. And I think there were he made a distinction between um, the concept of being present at hand and
And
what's the other
ready at
one?
hand. Zuhanden and Vorhanden in the beginning of being in time.
Yeah,
Right.
it gets
So
translated present at hand and ready to hand, I believe.
Yes.
and ready to
Yeah.
hand. Yeah. So we if we're going to use the fork as a utensil, it's uh, ready to hand, isn't it? But if something happens to the fork, if it's made of plastic and it breaks, then it turns into a present at hand. So we need to direct our focus to the fork to see, oh, what's happened here? You know, I need something better in order to carry on eating or something along those lines. And I wonder if there's something there to do with teleology and human psychology. So we view
Oh,
objects as
absolutely.
means to an end, you know. I mean, can you guys say something more about that or elaborate, or have I said everything?
No, go ahead,
You know
Richard.
what I find so great about Heidegger, and as I think you know, I have a book on Heidegger and religion. Um, um, and again, it's always so paradoxical. Um, I mean, what I think that Heidegger does with his notion of being in the world and his notion of the nature of temporality is he makes it clear that from a phenomenological point of view, a being is manifest axiologically. That is to say, being presents itself to us as having value, right? And and that's what the ready to hand means. Now, the fork has the value of being able to
Eat.
conduct food into my mouth, and
Yeah.
that's our immediate experience of being is of being as ready to hand. Our being is axiological by its very nature, and therefore, if our being is of being as such, that then leads to the conclusion that being as such is axiological by its very nature, and that, of course, is the religious understanding of being as God. Um, and I think that, but Heidegger doesn't use the word axiological, and he doesn't like the word axiological, and that's why it's in some sense paradoxical. Um, but I think one of Heidegger's complaints about modernity and the whole modern approach to life is that given the anxiety that is inherent to the axiology of being as we experience it, right? We seek to flee from that anxiety. We seek to deny our experience. And so the modern world has immersed itself in this objectivist, present at hand way of conceptualizing reality that is, in fact, a self alienated way of conceptualizing reality. Heidegger speaks of it as inauthenticity.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and that is all part of what I consider to be Heidegger's really brilliant analysis of the human situation and the human condition. Um, I don't think he provides the solution to it. I
Mm.
think that Yeah, go ahead,
Richard, I
Philip.
really like where that takes us. Um, you bring the angst, the anxiety of being into the center, which is paradigmatically in Heidegger and major influence on Tillot's entire writing, from The Courage to Be through to the end of his life, I think. And that comes in, one can respond, as you just said, to the anxiety either authentically or inauthentically. And in his major work being in time, Heidegger makes the whole focus on how to live in the world in der Weltsein, so living in the world in an authentic manner. And that strikes me as immensely relevant to today's context and as the backdrop to all the topics we've talked about today, because we have more excuse, more tendency to live inauthentically now with the growth of technology, our chance to have our deepest conversation with chat bots who form for some people their most intimate interpersonal connection of all.
Mhm.
And they're all ways to live the level of anxiety, and especially for millennials and Gen Z, is higher than I think previous generations, many previous generations have known. And therefore, the temptation to be inauthentic, not to live sort of open to the anxiety and what might be a response to it, but to close down, to move into chat, echo chambers, internally directed lifestyles, whether it's gaming or making your billions,
What about
is that
geriatric?
temptation is higher than ever before, perhaps.
What
Yeah.
about geriatric millennials? I was born in 82. Are we okay?
Geriatric millennials, I've never heard that phrase
I know,
before.
I came up with that. I came up with that.
That ought to be a contradiction
I'm
in
right on the
terms for people
cusp,
like
so
Richard and me.
I'm trying to be open to as many ideas as possible that
Richard,
I resonate with. So,
yeah,
yeah,
I
I
know
think
you
you
are.
guys
It
are
is
brilliant.
Go ahead, Richard.
it is so extraordinary, isn't it, that the more technologically adept we become at satisfying what Aristotle would call the appetitive
Yeah,
nature of our soul, right? The more technologically adept we become at satisfying all our apparent needs, the more anxious we
yeah,
become.
well said. Well
That's
You
said.
right. Yeah.
know, the less settled we are in ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's certainly something that I think religion attempts to address.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And would you say that religion, like Heidegger and Tillich, ask us to confront the anxiety, the source of that anxiety, to reflect on it as a existentialia, an existential feature of human existence, as in a sense we've been doing since the opening of this podcast, and then to find a way to live authentically with it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that expresses it very well. But here's the sort of once again the little sort of paradox, and that is that in order to do that, in order to confront that anxiety, and be willing to do so, you already need a certain amount of faith that
Yeah.
that the anxiety can somehow be tolerated and borne. Because if the anxiety is just too much for you, too overwhelming for you, then you almost have no choice but to divert yourself from it.
So
Um,
I think I and my co-author Steve Knapp would disagree with you on that. And we would say the first virtue is not faith, but hope. And even
Hope.
if we don't really have faith, trust is going to happen. We can hope, hope against hope, a kind of radical hope that, we see in Gen Z and many millennials, that somehow it's going to work out, all appearances notwithstanding. I think that can be the very first step, in my view.
Well, I'll go with you there, Philip. I'll yeah, I mean hope to me, as we were talking about, faith and hope sort of form a unit. In
Yeah.
order for hope to be alive, you have to have faith that the hope can be fulfilled, and in order to have faith, faith vitalizes the hope. So I think they
So
both go
yeah, so we're
go hand
slightly
in hand in
different. I
some
would
sense.
say that there can be a hope-based faith. So I start with mere hope, hope against hope, radical hope in the face of, say, what looks like an impossible environmental situation. And I begin to act. And as I act and carry out steps and study and look at possible solutions, I find that my hope becomes the foundation for a kind of faith that we can do
Yeah.
it. Hey, guys, we can do this. Not because I can prove it with science or religion, but because in our action, out of the hope, sometimes that faith that you talk about is a byproduct.
Well, that's good too. I'll
Yeah.
go with that. Yes. Very
I think
nice.
our, I think we've brought Arlindo to a perfect task of tying this conversation together
Yeah,
exactly at the right
definitely.
time.
I was only going to say, listening to you two talk about hope and faith, I start thinking that it places emphasis on belief. So even when it looks like there's no way out, when the evidence, the available evidence at present is telling you that there's no way out, you have to believe that there is a way out in order for you to move in the opposite direction against um, hopelessness. And that requires a kind of faith. Uh, if you're in mortal danger, uh, we have to be aware of the fact that we are limited as individuals, and perhaps we don't have all the knowledge that is necessary to make a decision, a proper decision. So what's helpful might be to believe that there is a way out, even if we don't have evidence for it. And that's the definition of faith, isn't it? And if we believe that there is a way out, we begin to act on it, and we might be free of that situation, the dangerous situation. Whereas if we just take on board the evidence around us, as some scientists do, we might just conclude prematurely, this is hopeless, there's no way out, according to the evidence. And it leaves out faith and hope. And then you're definitely going to die if you're in mortal danger. I mean, what do you guys think? I think it's important to have faith and hope. Hope is one of the virtues as well. I think, yeah, they kind of come as
I
a unit. However,
I think it's a brilliant summary of where we've gone these last few hours.
yeah,
That's very good. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. And
Thank you.
in some ways, we've wrapped ourselves around, right? So, I mean, you began with the ontological condition and what is the theological answer? And in some way, we've said, well, the ontological condition is that we are ontologically uncertain and insecure, and the theological response is to lean into our hope and ultimately faith. Yeah.
yeah,
That's lovely. It's like T.S. Eliot saying that we come back to the place and know it as if for the first time.
Yes, that's very good. Yeah.
that's right.
Thank you, Arlindo, for arranging this fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you
you
very much,
very
Richard.
much.
You guys
It's
have
been
been
wonderful. Thank you.
brilliant. Yeah, it's
Yes.
been wonderful. I'm
Yes.
going to end it here. Thank you so much, and maybe until next time.